Hello, I'm Rachael Babin from the Oncology Network. Welcome to the Oncology Podcast's Experts on Point series. Liver cancer is currently the 7th deadliest cancer in Australia. Liver cancer mortality rates continue to grow faster than any other cancer. Incidence rates are 3 times higher among men than women, and the survival rate is just over 20%. Today I'm chatting to Associate Professor Eleonora Feletto about efforts to transform liver cancer control in Australia. Eleonora leads the Gastrointestinal Cancers Policy and Evaluation stream at the Daffodil Centre. Her current work focuses on prevention and early detection of colorectal and liver cancer in Australia and overseas. I hope you enjoy listening. And just a reminder that healthcare professionals can access all of our podcasts for free, including show notes, on our website. To access these great resources, join the Oncology Network. Head over to oncologynetwork.com.au. This is Rachael Babin, and this is the Oncology Podcast. Hi, Eleonora. Welcome to the Oncology Podcast's Experts on Point series.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Now, I like to start with a personal question, if I may, just to help our listeners to connect with you. So can you tell me something surprising about yourself?
Sure, I'd love to. I guess if we're thinking about how listeners might connect with me, it's important to understand that I have studied improv before. So sometimes what I say just came straight out of my mouth without going via my brain for sense checking. So it makes for some hilarious situations, but quite often I need to apologize in retrospect. So I think that's a really good preface for today's conversation, to be honest.
You've set that up beautifully. What a fascinating insight, improv classes. So does that mean that you're a yes person? That's the whole improv thing? Yeah, yes and.
The reason I did it in the first place was for work. We had media training and I wasn't great at it, but that was fine. That's why we had training. And then the trainer did little sort of recordings and we listened back to them. And as soon as he put a video camera on me, I froze and I did not know what to do and I did not know what to say. And I thought, if this has to be part of my role, I need to figure this out. And so it was suggested to me that if nothing else, it would be a good time. And it absolutely is a good time. I highly recommend it to everyone in every circumstance, as you can always learn something.
It's an incredibly brave thing to do. It's quite confronting to admit that you struggle with something like that and then literally throw yourself in the deepest deep end.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's always a safe environment in class. Performing on stage was definitely an adventure, and I often didn't invite people I knew. So I was never quite that brave. But once my parents were in the audience and my brother as well, and we had to do a particular exercise where we had to remember the alphabet, and every sentence had to start with the next letter of the alphabet. So you had to both be paying attention to what someone was saying, but also remember where you were in the alphabet. And I got stuck at one point. I couldn't remember what letter we were up to. So I had to say the alphabet in my head, but it wasn't totally in my head. It was a tiny bit out loud. And all I could hear was my brother's laugh, just the ridicule laugh that only an older brother can pass on. That was a highlight.
Siblings cut through in a way like nobody else.
They sure do. They just know you better than anyone, and they know when you're about to make a fool of yourself.
Well, that's a really lovely, surprising fact. Thank you very much. I'm so glad I asked you. So now we'll move on to what we're here to discuss today, which is a roadmap for liver cancer from the Cancer Council Australia and the Daffodil Centre, which was released in tandem with new clinical practice guidelines for hepatocellular carcinoma surveillance for people at high risk. So for our broader audience, I'm hoping you could just briefly set the scene for us. So how prevalent is liver cancer in Australia? What are the mortality rates? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So firstly, thank you for asking me to talk about this today. I say thank you especially because liver disease and liver cancer aren't issues we hear about too often. But liver cancer is really one of the most rapidly growing cancer types in Australia. It's the 7th deadliest cancer. And as incidence and mortality rates in cancer, many other cancers and cancer in general have been dropping in Australia, liver cancer is unique, not in a good way. Incidence and mortality rates have increased substantially over the recent decades, and they're projected to increase further to 2044. So alongside these figures, we also know that incidence rates are 3 times higher in men than in women, and finally survival is at 22%. So it's statistics like these that means our focus has been both on trying to understand more about the disease, but also what we can do to change the landscape of liver cancer in the future and hopefully improve outcomes. And that's really where the roadmap came into being.
So it's quite unusual in the oncology world now to have a cancer where the survival rates are so low and where you're expecting mortality to grow, not shrink.
Yes, it is. As I said, especially in Australia, it's really unusual. And I think what that tells us is that once liver cancer is diagnosed, there aren't too many options that are available. There are some, but there aren't a whole lot. So certainly what a lot of our work has sort of led us to focus on are the prevention and early detection possibilities in this space.
And is there a difference between men and women when it comes to liver cancer?
So as I mentioned before, the incidence rate is about 3 times higher in men than in women. And I imagine you're probably going to ask me why.
Indeed, I am.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to tell you that sex difference isn't really clear. There's not a lot that would tell us exactly why that's happening. It could be to do with the prevalence of some of the lifestyle-related risk factors that are associated with liver cancer. People have started to explore the possibility of some hormonal factors, but there's certainly nothing conclusive. If I might, for a minute, if it's okay, talk to you a little bit more about the risk factors, I think that really helps. Just understand perhaps not exactly why there's a sex difference, but definitely why there's an emerging problem. So it's important to understand the key risk factors and also how liver disease and liver cancer develop. The major lifestyle and environmental risk factors that are associated with liver cancer are, firstly, infection. So this is where chronic hepatitis infection, mostly hepatitis B and hepatitis C, play a big part. Behavioural risk factors in the second instance, and so here especially we're talking about excessive alcohol consumption. And lastly, what we're now referring to as metabolic factors. So this is where we consider excess body fat, or what we might refer to as obesity, and the metabolic syndrome, which includes diabetes. These factors are of particular importance to liver cancer. And so when I mentioned before about how liver cancer develops, that's quite important to understand too, because the cancer develops from a damage or scarring to the liver. That damage can progress over time and get progressively worse. And then that progresses into advanced liver disease. Advanced liver disease can be referred to as advanced fibrosis or cirrhosis. And cirrhosis is also a key risk factor for liver cancer. So when we think about liver cirrhosis, what's been found is that 80% of people diagnosed with hepatocellular carcinoma, or HCC, have liver cirrhosis. So HCC is the most common type of liver cancer, so that's what we know the most about. So when we're thinking about what we can do or why there might be differences between different groups in the population, we're often thinking about the prevalence of these risk factors, but also the presence of cirrhosis as well. What we tend to look at as well is how could we potentially intervene and make a difference and improve outcomes.
Beyond these lifestyle factors, are there any other groups that are at higher risk?
So when we were considering the roadmap and considering the guidelines, we did identify some key high-risk groups, and those generally in this space are people with cirrhosis and people with chronic disease. So as I mentioned before, people with cirrhosis, taking that first group, they're highlighted specifically because that scarring has developed to a point where it is more likely to develop into liver cancer. And people with chronic hepatitis infection This is usually hepatitis B or hepatitis C, as I mentioned before. In the Australian context, the groups of people who tend to have higher prevalence of this infection are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people from an Asia-Pacific background, or people from a sub-Saharan African background. And that tends to be because of a prevalence of these infections in those groups already.
And is there much understanding about why these groups are more likely to develop these kind of infections?
So people with an Asian Pacific background or sub-Saharan Africa, it tends to be endemic in their sort of country of origin or region of origin. And so in the case of people with an Asia Pacific background, so we're talking about migrants too, and with people with an Asia Pacific background, we're not only talking about migrants, we're also talking about people born in Australia who might have had mother-to-child transmission, and then it becomes more prevalent in those communities as well. So it becomes really important to be able to communicate what the situation is and what to do if that does happen.
So now we understand the risks of liver cancer better and the people who are at higher risk. Let's move on to the roadmap itself. So what are you hoping to achieve with this plan over the next 2, 5 and 10 years?
Let me start by telling you a little bit about the roadmap itself and what we were trying to do. So we brought a group of people together, experts, an expert advisory group, members of the community, and we also more broadly consulted with key stakeholders in the space of liver cancer to determine what could possibly be priority actions over the next 2, 5 and 10 years. And so by priority actions, we were really just asking them, what can we do? How can we make things better? And by putting them all together in a document that we've called the roadmap is really about trying to put a shared agenda together that we can share with government, key stakeholders, health bodies, and with all of us with the intent of trying to improve liver cancer care, experience, and outcomes over time. So I guess just in reflecting on the whole process, I wanted to share that there was just so much enthusiasm to be involved in something like this, so much interest in making a difference, and so much support from the hepatology field to put something together so we were all on the same page. So as I mentioned before, we brought together experts and people with lived experience and policymakers as well and researchers. And what they all told us was that prevention and early detection was where we really had the most hope and potential to make a difference, because we see that sort of the survival rate, as we mentioned before, is quite low. So if you can prevent that cancer altogether or get it early enough when there's curative treatment is possible, that's really where we're going to be able to make a difference and achieve what we want to achieve, which is really improving outcomes. What that means is making people's lives better if they are diagnosed with a liver cancer, or making sure people don't get diagnosed in the first place. So I guess when we think about achievements and what we do want to achieve, the roadmap really outlines 3 key things. And they're, in my view, they're increasing awareness of liver cancer and acknowledging that liver cancer issues can be integrated into some of our existing government frameworks and strategies and activities that are already happening, but acknowledging that liver cancer is part of what we're trying to improve. Secondly, it's about increased capacity and infrastructure in primary care. So I don't think Australia is very unique in the situation where primary care is under a lot of pressure all the time, and they are well placed to screen for advanced liver disease or provide HCC surveillance or the appropriate referral for HCC surveillance. And so increasing that capacity and infrastructure to support primary care. And then lastly, not forgetting about people who do have a diagnosis of liver cancer and providing support for those people post-diagnosis in terms of surveillance of their condition, as well as availability and access to the care and resources that they might need.
Fantastic. Thank you for outlining that so eloquently for us. I know it's a big roadmap and they're very big ambitions, and sometimes it's hard to kind of put that in a nutshell. So thank you. How does the roadmap in particular address health inequities?
Yeah, health inequities is so important for us to talk about in general. And I mean, even just thinking back to all the key high-risk groups that we highlighted as part of the roadmap, it's impossible not to talk about health inequities because we're automatically dealing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, we're dealing with new migrants, we're dealing with not necessarily new migrants, just migrants or multicultural communities. And they are groups where the social determinants of health, the commercial determinants of health, the behavioural determinants of health, they all play a really critical role. And we really need to consider how the access to healthcare and the availability of healthcare and health literacy all plays into how we are trying to improve outcomes in this area. We certainly, as part of the roadmap, specifically call out the need to improve health literacy and awareness in the high risk groups that are especially relevant for liver cancer. And we also go as far as raising the need for culturally safe and sensitive healthcare. Mm-hmm. These issues, and both of these issues, they're not at all exclusive to liver cancer. Mm-hmm. They're much broader to healthcare. I think our position in putting together this document and the space we want it to hold is really about contributing to that conversation as well and making sure those issues are at the forefront and we're not forgetting that they should be acknowledged and we can highlight those. And that's part of what we can contribute with this to the broader conversation about health inequities.
Are you expecting to change the way liver cancer is controlled in Australia? I mean, how quickly do you think you will see meaningful results and a reduction in that quite sobering mortality rate?
Our expectation with the roadmap is that we make a start in changing how we consider liver cancer. Changing exactly how it's controlled or exactly what's done, perhaps that won't happen immediately as a result of this document. And change isn't necessarily about shifting practice dramatically, but certainly what we've aimed to do is get liver cancer on the agenda. Get people talking about it, increasing the profile. And once people do realise that it's there and that something should be done, then with this document, providing them some guidance on what can be done. Will that come to a meaningful result in a reduction in mortality soon? Probably not, unfortunately, because those things take quite some time to manifest, especially in the data. But there's certainly hope that things can improve. I think it will be incremental. So I couldn't put a date on when it would be, and quickly is probably not a word I would use.
Yes, and is it important to come into a process like this, which is such a huge challenge, with that realistic lens?
I think it certainly is, and I think that is very much why we took the lens of those timeframes of 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years, and we thought very long and hard about those, really thinking what should be prioritised first in the 2-year space, what could come later in the 5-year space, and what is really what we want to be working towards in the long term. Look, maybe 2 years is even optimistic, but better to be optimistic and at least have a plan and be able to revisit that in 2 years' time and see how we've progressed.
But it must be heartening, as you said when we first started talking about it, is that the stakeholders and the other people that you've been speaking to whilst you were developing this roadmap were so enthusiastic, and there is a kind of combined energy to try and make an effective change.
Yes, definitely. Having worked in cancer research for a little bit of time, I think this is one of my unique experiences where people have just come together and wanted to help. And when they've expressed their opinions, other people have been on board and supported that. I think that's been really encouraging through the process.
Yeah, fantastic. It's also lovely to hear as well, because we speak to a lot of researchers who have continual battles, usually around funding or getting in front of the right people at the right time who can give you the funding. So it's actually really heartening to hear a really kind of positive, uplifting experience like that. So thank you.
Well, don't get me wrong, funding isn't easy to come by. And if anyone listening to this would like to provide more funding in liver cancer space, I know many researchers who would be very willing. Liver cancer is one of the more underfunded. So, yeah, it doesn't get a whole lot of benefit of the different schemes and the different grant opportunities that some others might.
So you say there is less funding and research into liver cancer control compared to the other kind of cancer types. Why do you think that is?
I mean, that's $10 million question. Inflation has probably raised it from the $1 million question to the $10 million question. But look, I wish I knew. I definitely wish I knew why liver cancer attracted less funding. There are a lot of people doing really good work in this area, and they could continue to do good work with more funding. But I reflect on a recent overview from Cancer Australia, and they sort of outlined the funding in cancer research. And in 2018 to 2020, there were 39 liver cancer focused projects, and the total funding amount was $11.4 million. And that was great because it was an increase from when they first started tracking it in 2003 to 2005, where there were 10 projects and $1.1 million. But it really is a long way behind the recent figures. So the 2018 to 2020 funding, again, liver cancer got $11.4 million. Breast cancer had $93.3 million. Leukemia had $67.9 million. And that's not to say any particular cancer type should get less or should get more. It's just to illustrate the limited funding that liver cancer does have based on this report. And I mean, I guess one of the reasons could be because of the lower public profile of liver cancer. It's not a cancer. If you asked a random selection of people to name a cancer type, I'm not sure liver would be one of the first.
Mm-hmm.
And so perhaps that may have contributed in some way.
Hopefully this kind of work again all feeds back into that ongoing process of raising awareness. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting illustration when you have those figures so starkly presented, and then you keep in the back of your mind the fact that this is a cancer where the mortality rate is rising. It must feel quite challenging at times, like it's a bit of an uphill struggle.
It does, and it surely is an uphill battle. It feels like there is good progress that we could make, though, and we can do some really good work and try and improve outcomes here.
So, alongside the roadmap, clinical guidelines for HCC surveillance were also released. Now, is there a problem with liver cancer screening and surveillance in Australia?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. We're talking a lot about screening and surveillance in Australia, especially now given the National Lung Cancer Screening Program has recently been approved, and we're waiting with bated breath to see how that sort of takes place and rolls out. Might be a good example for us to follow in liver cancer, but that could be between you and me and all of the listeners. I guess when we were developing, when we were going through this process, what we did is a preliminary look at some of the evidence in two key spaces, because there are two key interventions where, when we talk about liver cancer screening and surveillance, there are two areas that we think about. One is screening for advanced liver disease, and one is HCC surveillance. So a bit more rigorous surveillance for people who are considered high risk. When we looked at that, there was limited evidence for screening for advanced liver disease and much more promising evidence for HCC surveillance. And so this really led to the focus of the guidelines. HCC surveillance is a relatively well-established intervention, and what it does, as I mentioned before, we're looking to see how can we detect this a bit earlier where we can provide curative treatment. And it's a well-established intervention to facilitate that early diagnosis based on regular monitoring of people who are in this high-risk group. So internationally, HCC surveillance is recommended for people with cirrhosis, so that sort of more extreme scarring of the liver, and those with chronic hepatitis B. And so what we've seen is those groups we know fairly well that should be done. And these guidelines were exploring, well, are there any other groups where we know HCC surveillance should be provided? And when we're talking about HCC surveillance, it's probably important to just clarify, we're talking about someone every 6 or 12 months, depending on which international guidance we were looking at before. Someone would be provided an ultrasound, and then they may get that with or without another test. So it's a tumor biomarker test called alpha fetoprotein, or AFP testing. And there are places like Japan and South Korea where this is a national program, where this is provided to people who are in those high-risk groups. And in those contexts, it's been seen to improve survival and to be a really successful program. So I think that's just kind of important to consider. So we looked at the evidence in developing these guidelines and determined what's appropriate for the Australian context in a systematic way. So this is where the guidelines and the roadmap overlapped. You might say this is the right thing to do, but when you think, how does that get done? That's where the roadmap was able to provide some guidance on, well, we don't have a systematic way of providing surveillance at the moment. We don't have a program, a formal program, a place where everything is registered and data is centrally collected. So we don't really know what's happening on the ground. And so the roadmap highlighted these areas and made part of the priority actions to formalize these processes, to have a repository for national data so we're able to see, are people doing this or aren't there? There's no way we really know in a formal sense. Anecdotally, we can find out. There are some smaller studies that show us that it is happening. People aren't always adherent, so they don't always come to their appointments to get their ultrasound.
Yeah, there's always the human factor. So in an ideal world, would a model similar to the Japanese model with a really formalized, quite serious program, and the data is tracked, would that be your ideal?
So in places like Japan and South Korea, the rates of liver cancer are much higher. So it's more of a population level program. So in Australia, like we have in breast, in cervical, in bowel cancer, in liver cancer, surveillance is not appropriate for the general population. I think the similarities with the lung cancer program and what we're looking to do in that space, where people are identified in high-risk groups and those groups perhaps need to filter into a formal program, could be a possibility for Australia.
Now, what about people who are in regional or rural Australia? Do they experience the same kind of access to surveillance and indeed to treatment?
Yeah. Well, look, the data, unfortunately, on surveillance and treatment in general are quite limited. So unpicking what's happening at a regional and rural level in Australia is even more difficult. I guess what we know and what we were able to talk to people about is that the availability of services, especially ultrasound, which is central to HCC surveillance, is limited based on what they're telling us in regional and rural Australia. So it does suggest that there are some geographic gaps as well that we're facing that we need to deal with. In the area of ultrasound, though, one of the things that was raised to us that was really quite interesting is around portable ultrasounds or point-of-care ultrasounds. And they've been sort of highlighted as a really useful way to address the availability of services in non-urban locations. There isn't a lot of evidence around this. We don't know formally a whole lot, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not being used very much. It's just we don't know what we don't know at this point. I think one of the advantages we've been told with these particular devices is they can be used by non-sonographers and they have the potential to improve diagnostic accuracy and patient care. So those are all positives that hopefully, exploring use of services like this can provide better outcomes or reduce those gaps between people in regional and rural Australia with those in urban locations.
It's always incredible, isn't it, how new technology can bridge these enormous distances, and particularly when it comes around to workforce as well and the kind of the practicalities of delivering interventions. So that's really interesting. I'd now like to explore the psychosocial factors and stigma So do you think, we've talked about cirrhosis quite a bit. Do you think that hepatocellular carcinoma is viewed as a drinker's disease and therefore perhaps elicits a less sympathetic response? Or perhaps it's a disease that people think only affects certain cultural groups. It's not something that people worry about so much.
Liver cancer has another similarity with lung cancer in that the stigma you associate with a smoker developing lung cancer could also be the same for someone who drinks too much and liver cancer. That's not always the case, as it is with lung cancer. And I think that there is a level of stigma because of the particular types of risk factors that are associated with liver cancer, but I'm not sure it gets necessarily a less sympathetic response. I think any diagnosis of cancer generally gets a sympathetic response, but people simply don't understand enough about liver disease and liver cancer. And part of what we want to do in the roadmap is help educate and help improve understanding around liver cancer. And if that in turn helps reduce stigma, that's certainly something that we would love to be able to contribute to.
And what kind of plans are there within the roadmap to specifically sort of tackle that stigma and discrimination and to start those conversations about education?
So as part of the roadmap, we have highlighted the integration of liver cancer into existing strategies and frameworks as a quick way of acknowledging how liver cancer integrates with what we're already doing. And certainly in light of the national hepatitis B and C strategies and their implementation work towards reducing stigma and discrimination in those areas, that's certainly something the roadmap calls out in support of. When it comes to education and awareness, I think anything we can contribute to improving people's understanding, both people who are at high risk, but also the general population of what liver cancer means, how it develops, will work towards reducing discrimination and stigma.
It's a very dark area, it feels like. It's one of those things that people can see that it exists, but it's quite hard to quantify sometimes. And so perhaps that emphasis on education is, as you say, a kind of a quick way to kind of cut through.
Yeah, and it's a start. It's not the final answer, but a lot of what we've put forward in the roadmap are starting points, and they're not the be-all and end-all, and they're not the only thing that can be done. But as I said, they're guidance, and there is work ongoing in the stigma area and helping to reduce that and to identify it first, and then identifying how that can be reduced. And so supporting that kind of work and that research is of utmost importance in the liver cancer space for sure.
Absolutely. And as you say, this is the beginning of a journey which will unfold over the decades, actually, I'm sure. These things don't change quickly. So, Eleonora, was there anything else that you'd like to mention, or perhaps a key take-home message you'd like to share with our listeners?
To improve outcomes in liver cancer, we all need to be mindful of what the best evidence is, but also what's practical in our context and what we can do. We can't make any decisions without considering the people with lived experience, the clinicians who have to provide these services, and the policymakers as well, to ensure that we have buy-in at all levels. We really need to be cognizant of the diversity in liver cancer as well, and recognise that these same solutions aren't going to work for every group in the same way, and that we have to overcome health-related barriers in this space and healthcare-related barriers, but also these discrimination and stigma-related issues. So it's a really complex problem. It's not going to be easy, but this work is a place to start, and it's an informed place to start by a lot of people who know a lot more than I do. So I'm really proud that we've been able to put this together and that we're able to share that with the community.
That's a lovely wrap-up. Thank you, and congratulations. I know it wouldn't have been an easy undertaking at all. So we will, of course, include the links to the roadmap and the guidelines in the show notes on our website. Were there any other resources that you'd like to mention that listeners might find helpful?
In general, I would say that the Cancer Council Australia resources are always quite useful. Being the developers of the guidelines, that's probably a good example of that, but also in terms of material for the community as a whole, the Understanding Cancer booklets are always my recommendation for the first place to start for any type of cancer.
Lovely. And was there anything for healthcare professionals that you'd like to mention?
On our Cancer Council Australia website, we have the links to all of the guidelines and all of the roadmap materials as well that are designed for healthcare professionals that hopefully they'll find useful, as well as some work that's happened out of Cancer Council Victoria, specifically for primary healthcare. So they're the best link, to be honest.
Fantastic. So thank you so much for your time today, Eleonora. Please keep us updated on how things progress.
We definitely will. Thank you very much for having me.
Absolute pleasure. You've been listening to the Oncology Podcast's Experts on Point series, brought to you by the Oncology Network. To hear more podcast episodes, head over to our oncology portal at www.oncologynetwork.com.au. Registration is free for healthcare professionals and will give you access to exclusive content and educational podcasts. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your colleagues and please contact us if you have exciting research news to share with our listeners. This is Rachael Babin and this is the Oncology Podcast.